action-packed hour and a half talking through Leviticus 1 through 7. So, right, it's what you got up thinking about this morning, right? All you Bible nerds, I know that's how you are. All right, so we're going to try to be ambitious, but we have some room to work with. So if we don't actually get through all of it tonight and there's a need to push some of this off a little further in the future, I think we can condense down some of the material in Leviticus in future weeks and revisit this, because as a prologue to the book, which is a rather lengthy one, then there's a lot here to say. We kind of need to work on trying to get right. Remember, the goal behind the project is to basically set some guideposts in place to help us better understand how to read and interpret and understand this literature as we're working through it personally on our own. All right, not to get super deep down into the weeds and discuss all the theology involved, because we certainly don't have the time to do that here in this forum. But tonight I hope to engage your minds perhaps in a slightly new way than I have before. I'm not going to tell you what that is. It's no special trick up my sleeve, but I really want you to think with me through this and interact with me as I'm asking you some questions. No trick questions, that I do promise. And just try to help you work through this with me so that you can come to hopefully some conclusions, but at the same time, I'm also going to work to try my best not to be dogmatic with what it is that I'm saying, because not in every place is it a teacher's job when it comes to handling the scriptures to tell you what to think. Sometimes you kind of get that temptation a little bit, I guess, with occupying the position of pastor because you want to rightly guide and so forth the flock, but here we have the space and the opportunity to ask those questions that typically aren't going to get brought up, addressed, or answered in the Sunday morning set and whatnot. And of course, you're here because you have the appetite to want to dig deeper and tickle your curiosity centers with those questions. So with that in mind, let's get started. All right. This slide right here has a gajillion verses on it, and I'm going to try to read a lot of them, but not all of them. But in order for us to really understand what's going on operatively in these 7 chapters that deal so much with sacrificial language and so forth, and the cultic rites. I know we kind of have something of a negative stigma when it comes to using the word cult, but cult in and of itself is just routine rote religious practice in the biblical sense. So what we're talking about are those things that actually happen when we visit the inner sanctum of the tabernacle, and of course at the altar of sacrifice. And so these things are liturgical in nature with respect to several of these sacrifices happening or coinciding with various high feast days or high Sabbaths and whatnot. And of course just the regular routine thing. And we're going to see a lot of these texts, dare I use the priestly term, sprinkled, not only given a big bolus of it here to focus on, but even some of this has already been addressed a little bit in the text from Exodus, and of course we're going to see more of this being addressed in the book of Numbers. And so getting it right here helps us better interpret some of the things we've already kind of perused through, sets us up better for things that we're going to be talking about when we get to Numbers. We can use these as reference points. Okay, so this is not an exhaustive list by no means, but some of the more common and familiar terms we run into. This perhaps is a bit of a caveat because ransom is not really one of those terms that we see often in the New Testament, but it's interesting to see Jesus' concept of soteriology, doctrine of salvation, from his own standpoint, what his role and identity was as Messiah, how he's coming to achieve salvation for his disciples and followers. So Matthew 20, verse 28, he says, "Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many." This word is actually rooted several places here in Torah, most notably and almost exclusively in the book of Leviticus, albeit here in this one instance, you see actually 2 different terms interspersed between Leviticus and Numbers, but in English, they might be translated interchangeably, but more often than not, as redeem. And an instance would be in Leviticus 25, verse 25, "If your brother becomes destitute, sells part of his property, his nearest relative may come and redeem or ga'al what his brother has sold." This is used most commonly of property such as houses, fields, animals, offerings, or even as slaves, but usually the person is acting as something of a kinsman redeemer. And what's interesting about this is also the way that it is talked about as goes redemption of Israel from Egypt in the great psalm of the Exodus, in Exodus 15 on the western side of the Red Sea, speaking about, again, how God has kind of redeemed or ransomed Israel out of Egypt, okay? So God, even in that instance, acting as a near kinsman redeemer to ransom. We've used this language before, talking about something given in exchange to acquire something back. Numbers 18:15. We kind of talked about this before going through Exodus. The firstborn of every living thing, human or animal, presented to the Lord belongs to you, but you must certainly redeem a human firstborn or ransom it back, redeem the firstborn of an unclean animal. Or Moses reflecting on what has happened over the last 40 years as he's talking on the edge of the wilderness at the Jordan River in Deuteronomy 7, verse 8. Because the Lord loved you, kept the oath he swore to your ancestors, he brought you out with a strong hand, redeemed you from the place of slavery, from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So certainly we have to recognize Jesus' use of biblical language like this in the Gospel of Matthew has all of those concepts, and there are so many more. As you can see, just the verse links that I've given in those three books, or I should say at least the amount of times that word is used, he's baking all of that into the cake to help his disciples better understand what this concept means. To speak of this divorced from the book of Leviticus is to basically just cut that verse of Matthew right out of the Bible, amputate it from its context, bleeding all over the place, and try to interpret it in a completely foreign and alien concept or sense of the word, which is not appropriate for biblical hermeneutics, right? All right, so wash would be another one. We encounter this in 1 Corinthians 6:11. Some of you used to be like this, but you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of our God. Many other uses of this, such as in Acts 22:16, where the person is being told, and now, why are you delaying? Get up, be baptized. Wash away your sins, calling on his name. Or Paul to Titus, and in one of his final letters, he, obviously Jesus, saved us, not by works of righteousness that we have done, but according to his mercy through the washing of regeneration and renewal by the Spirit. So with those, just two verses right there, we're thinking already of Christian hymnody and the idea of being washed in Jesus' blood, our sins purged from us by virtue of that fountain flowing from Emmanuel's veins. Problem is that in and of itself is not biblical literature. What we have to do is pull ourselves away from that, as beautiful and poetic as that might be, turn ourselves to what the Bible is actually saying, and consider the idea that in the person who is speaking in Acts and the person who is writing in Titus is a Jew, and of course they are steeped with the understanding of this priestly talk, which in Second Temple literature, period, spanning 500 years by the time Jesus has walked onto the scene and these men have started this mission work and so forth, the concept of the priestliness of Israel and just the idea of the priestliness and the activity of every individual person with the concept from the Pharisaical standpoint, which will become the rabbinical standpoint of being clean in all that you do. The idea of washing your vessels before you eat from them, washing your hands when you come from the marketplace. That's not founded in Moses' rules. Why is that? It's a priestly concept that's extrapolated from that literature about priests used by Pharisees, put forth toward everybody else, saying this is a really good idea for all of us to do, because if this helps makes the priest clean to operate in sacred space, then in a sense we're all kind of moving and walking and living in sacred space because we are God's sacred covenant people wherever we are. And of course in Jesus' Jewish world, there are Jews spread all over the place. So the idea of trying to remain untainted and undefiled by the world takes on a much deeper concept and a broader range than what Moses originally intended, usually just for the priests. So this is priestly language. When Paul is using this, or whoever the writer of Hebrew is in Hebrews 10:22, let us draw near with a true heart, full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience. The idea of being sprinkled here takes us all the way back to Numbers 19, and the idea of taking a red heifer, sacrificing it outside the camp, burning it to nothing but ash, taking those ashes, putting them in water, mixing it up real good, and then this water is used as a tool to purify people who are ceremonially unclean from touching dead bodies or whatever the idea is. Not sprinkling blood on people, because there are no religious practices, except for maybe one, with the cleansing of a leper, in which blood is actually taken from a sacrifice to be sprinkled on someone. The idea is that blood, if it's going to be sprinkled, is sprinkled on holy objects and in holy space, not on people. And when we're using this concept of sprinkling a person, it's the idea of being purified, washed, if you will. The sprinkling of this water that's mixed with death in the form of ash that somehow paradoxically cleans someone. All that's what's going on when we see these words here of wash. And of course, you see the breakdown there of either bodily washing, such as rakatz, or kabas in other places where a garment might be washed. And that also bears influence in the Revelation text, where John says, I said to him, Sir, you know. Then he told me, these are the ones who come out of great tribulation. They washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. All right? So anyway, trying to move at a slightly hurried pace. And if I need to stop and break this down anymore, please, by all means, raise the hand. I will be more than happy to slow it down. But moving on, purified. All right? Peter says in Peter 1:22, since you have purified yourselves by your obedience to the truth, so that you show sincere brotherly love for each other from a pure heart, love one another constantly. What is this idea of being purified? Again, Peter, Jewish, totally pulling from the inspiration of Levitical text here. And so is the author of Hebrews, as we already mentioned, that text in chapter 10, verse 22, sprinkled our hearts clean from an evil conscience. But again, taking us back to the idea of what's actually really kind of strange, and we're going to explore this a lot more from Leviticus 4 with the idea of the sin offering. Because in Leviticus, and of course in Numbers and whatnot, we'll see the word of the use of this Hebrew word, chata. It's fun to pronounce because you really get to clear your throat when you try to get that sound out there. But the chata, because chata is the word primarily used to speak of sin in just about any form you can imagine it in the Old Testament. But in some of these texts, I say some, but in truth it's many, in the Old Testament, the same word is used to speak of purification. Now, why in the world in the Hebrew language would they use the same term to describe sin, something that taints both ceremonially and morally, of course, the idea of making one impure. And then, of course, we use the same word to speak of purification. I don't know. I'm not a Hebrew scholar. I'm not an etymologist. I can't tell you where this word comes from and why it would be applied to both in the same context. But it's important for us to recognize that because sometimes English translators of the Bible are taking it upon themselves to interpret for us what they think the text is actually saying, as goes the use of this word, whether it means sinfulness or whether it means purification. All right, again, we're going to break that down as we move on. But the idea is, if purification is part of the context, then that, of course, is influencing Peter's speech here in Peter when he is saying that we have been purified, as goes this effect of us coming into Christ and being one with Him in covenant relationship. I expect to kind of use this as a platform to build on, so I'm not hopeful that you'll understand it all right now, but that you will in due time as we get a little bit deeper into this. All right, and then lastly, sprinkled. 1 Peter 1, verse 2, where it says, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, through the sanctifying work of the Spirit, to be obedient and to be sprinkled with the blood of Jesus Christ. May grace and peace be multiplied to you. Again, Hebrews 10:22, sprinkled. But this, of course, comes from Exodus 29, verse 21 as well. And here we have the idea of taking some of the blood that is on the altar, some of the anointing oil, and sprinkle them on Aaron and his garments. Now, this is another instance in which blood is actually used for sprinkling outside of just cleansing a leper. The idea here, though, is not so much the concept of cleansing of sin per se. It's a consecrative effort to install a man into an office, and it's also used of holy objects. So it's used to consecrate holy objects as well. Where is it that the priest, whether high priest or individual priests, sons of Aaron, are going to minister? Sacred space. In a sense, it's like they are considered the only animate holy object, but as part of that sanctum, they have to be cleansed and purified in the same way as the rest of all of those objects because they exist inside the bubble of this sacred space. When you consider the idea of what that means then Peter's speech goes a long way to talk more about the idea of us also working in the confines of sacred space, albeit globally, not just locally with one little shrine, but the idea that we have become fit as sacred space for God's Holy Spirit to indwell in us, to live here in the space where in the Old Testament sense it was just tabernacle, it was just temple. Now it's the ability for him to be able to live in unfit, impure vessels. And it goes way beyond just the idea of us simply being forgiven or pardoned from our sins. It's the idea that we have been transformed into a sacred vessel or space for God's personal presence to actually inhabit. So all of these New Testament terms, again, coming from the confines of Leviticus mostly, because the references there are overwhelming in comparison to just about any other text. All right, getting that down now helps us not only understand Leviticus, but even other parts of the Bible. Hence the reason why I bring it up. Building upon this concept even more in the book of Hebrews. Man, we've got a lot of this. I want to read first that block in white right there, beginning with Aaron, all right? This comes from the Day of Atonement text in Leviticus 16. Aaron will present the bull for his sin offering, make atonement for himself and his household. Skipping to verse 9, he is to present the goat chosen by lot. Remember, there are two lots are cast. One has to be sacrificed. The other one is the goat that becomes the scapegoat, sent out to the uninhabitable place, or from the Hebrew, Azazel. We'll talk about that a couple of weeks from now in more length and depth. But for the sake of the reference tonight, we need to kind of have a feel for what that's about. Chosen by lot for the Lord and sacrifice it as a sin offering, he will make atonement for the most holy place in this way for all their sins because of the Israelites' impurities and rebellious acts. Now let's go to the Hebrews text. The reason why I'm doing this is because I think sometimes in our minds we have this a little bit conflated with respect to what actually is going on here at certain points in the biblical text. In other words, we have a tendency to think in our minds that the Day of Atonement actually operates much in the same way that Jesus' sacrifice does to ultimately expunge all sin of any type and category from every citizen in Israel at the time of the observance of the Day of Atonement. And again, the hymnody that usually seeps into our mind using New Testament biblical speech with respect to the idea of how we achieve atonement in Jesus and the concept of blood being applied, that also happens on the day of Passover, which is the reason why sin is removed, because we've got the idea of where blood is applied, but somehow we, I think, start to get the lines crossed in our minds that blood is also applied to people, but it is not. It is not. And it's important for us to get the religious rite down so we understand operatively what's actually going on here, because the writer of Hebrews certainly assumes that every one of their readers would absolutely understand this as much as they know the back of their own hand. Hebrews 5. Every high priest is also clothed with weakness. Because of this, he must make an offering for his own sins as well as for the sins of the people. So that line that I have right there, underlined, bolded, italicized, what is he referring to? Is he referring to daily offerings? Is he referring to a specific offering that a person may bring? Or is he referring to something else that sounds eerily familiar because I just read about it? What do you think he's alluding to? Anybody? The Day of Atonement, because he is offering for his own sins and then for the people. This is the only time of the year, and this is the only place in the Bible that we have anything at all speaking about the concept of a priest offering sacrifices at the same time for his own sins and then for the sins of the people. Moving on to Hebrews 7. He doesn't need to offer sacrifices every day as high priests do, first for their own sins and then for those of the people. What do you think he's alluding to? Is he alluding to the burnt offering of Leviticus 1? Is he alluding to the guilt offering of Leviticus 6? Or is he alluding to the Day of Atonement offering? Day of Atonement, okay? And then on to Hebrews 9. But the high priest alone enters the second room, and he does that only once a year and never without blood. But he offers for himself and for the sins of the people that they had committed in ignorance. Again, it's almost the same thing, verbatim. The idea there is that the Day of Atonement concept heavily permeates what's going on in Leviticus. We have to tease that out from what's being said here in these front 7 chapters as the prologue to Leviticus. Moving on in Leviticus 16 at the bottom of the screen, the priest who is anointed and ordained to serve as high priest, he must make atonement. He will make atonement for the most holy place. Let me read that again. He will make atonement for the most holy place. He will make atonement for the tent of meeting and the altar, and will make atonement for the priests and all the people of the assembly. This is to be a permanent statute for you to make atonement for the Israelites once a year because of all their sins. Hebrews 10 verse 1. Since the law was only a shadow of the good things to come and not the reality itself of those things, the writer says it can never perfect the worshipers by the same sacrifices that they continually offer year after year. Now, with the use of that phrase, year after year, it's possible this could be alluding to daily sacrifices, whether it be the ones made in the morning and the evening, liturgical sacrifices, as goes Passover, Day of Atonement, any of those things. And of course, it's more than just on the Day of Atonement, Aaron's sacrifice and then the sacrifice for the people. There are several sacrifices that happen during that day. Or it could be to personal offerings that are being given. But more than likely, with the use of that phrase, year after year, what can we assume is being placed at the center point of focus of this? What specific day on the calendar? Probably all right, verses 3 and 4. But in these sacrifices, there is a reminder of sins year after year. Operatively, we might think this is still Day of Atonement that's being addressed. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. This is huge. We have to, even though at this point in the Levitical text, as we are just beginning to explore what these sacrifices are, we can use extrapolating some of the theology from the New Testament itself, which obviously at the time of its writing is far closer to the time in which these things were actually still operating within the temple itself. One thing that changed immediately or within a few generations after the temple was brought down by the Romans is the way that the Jewish community at large began to contemplate the reflection of what is now considered the Day of Atonement. Why? Because there is no sanctum for them to bring in the blood and apply to anything that has cherubim on it, where God meets with His people. There is no anything of meeting where the people are represented by their priesthood. So instead of the Levitical speech that I just read to you of the idea of cleansing holy space from the defilement that comes from the impurities of both priesthood and people, now it becomes a personal reflection of one's own sins and the idea of trying to atone by bloodless means of one's infractions, whether deliberate or undeliberate, toward God. But of course, that in and of itself is a manipulation of the Levitical text and an outright abandonment of what it originally said, because the Levitical text is geared toward the concept of the existence of physical, tangible, sacred space. And so the writer here is saying in Hebrews, it was always understood that this blood that is shed, either from goat or calf or bull, is never going to purge sin. Never. It had a completely different operative focus. Or in verse 11 of chapter 10, every priest stands day after day, ministering, offering the same sacrifices time after time, which can, again, never take away sin. So again, it's important for us to have a deep-rooted grasp of what Leviticus is saying, because you can see in just a little bit of a cross-section I've shared with you, it really permeates a lot of the space in the New Testament. If we don't have a good working function or knowledge of it, then we're going to be a little bit short-sighted. All right, this is where we left off last week when we finished up Exodus and Exodus 40 with the problem that we had. That problem being that now as the tabernacle has been assembled, everything from the shrine itself to the outer courtyard, God's presence moves from that tent of meeting outside the camp, not saying it was perpetually there all the time, but it's not going to descend there anymore to meet with anybody, specifically Moses. It is now descended and has filled up the tent of meeting that is the shrine, all right? And understanding the Hebrew phraseology, what is meant to be seen here is that that tent is really the innermost sanctum, the most holy space, where God dwells above the cherubim. And now that His glory has filled that space, for some reason, neither Moses or Aaron can enter in. That's how we close out the book of Exodus. It's a big problem. Because if they have built this thing to be a tent of meeting, the idea is communal access, is it not? The idea here is that everybody, in some limited way, being represented by their priests, is going to be able to come into some measure of proximity to God in His holiness. But now God's own spokesman in the people of Moses and Aaron can't even penetrate that space. Why? What is to be done about that? This is hugely scandalous. And this is where, and the reason why, we have the situating that we do of Leviticus in the canonical text and these next 7 chapters to break down before we get to the consecration or ordination ceremony in chapter 8 of the Levitical priests, the very first ones who are going to enter into that space and for 7 straight days be going through the process of being atoned for, consecrated, set apart to work and operate within that sacred space. All right, so jumping into Leviticus 1, let's read the first 9 verses. Then the Lord summoned Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. Speak to the Israelites and tell them, when any of you brings an offering to the Lord from the livestock, you may bring your offering from the herd or the flock. If this offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he is to bring an unblemished male. He will bring it to the entrance to the tent of meeting so that it may be accepted by the Lord. He is to lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering so that it can be accepted on his behalf to make atonement for him. He is to slaughter the bull before the Lord. Aaron's sons, the priest, are to present the blood, splatter it on all sides of the altar that is at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Then he is to skin the burnt offering, cut it into pieces. The sons of Aaron, the priest, will prepare a fire on the altar, arrange the wood on the fire. Aaron's sons, the priest, are to arrange the pieces, the head, the fat, on top of the burning wood on the altar. The offer is to wash its entrails and legs with water, and then the priest will burn all of it on the altar as a burnt offering, a food offering, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. All right, to the screen. Genesis 8, verse 20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord. He took some of every kind of clean animal, every kind of clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. Here's another verse from Genesis 22. The text of Abraham offering Isaac. Take your son, he said, your only son Isaac, whom you love. Go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. And one last one in Exodus 18. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal in God's presence. We have Leviticus 1 that's laying down instructions for burnt offerings. Here we have stories that span all the way back hundreds of years to Noah. And in every one of them, what is one common denominator that you see going on in each of these? Burnt offerings. So here we have sanctions as to how these things are to be offered. What can these texts tell us has been going on for hundreds of years, as goes those who call upon the name of the Lord or any other god or gods that they choose to worship? They have been offering what? So with that, if burnt offerings have been offered, even by those people who are a part of this line of descent of somewhat godly figures, as that's what we're going to call them, from Adam through Seth and Noah and so forth, all the way down to Abraham, and then now this covenant community that has risen from him. What we can say is that there must be a deeply ingrained knowledge of how to offer a burnt offering and what the purpose of it is. Now, not to say that some of that's not going to change now. If anything, it seems like some of this text may be regulatory, as goes what God expects and what purpose this means to serve from here on out. But notice there is no argument made in the first 9 verses I just read to you from Leviticus 1 of God telling the people, this is why you are to offer this, because this is what this means. The understanding is that that is already at play for them. We are the ones, on the other hand, that need to try to flesh out as best we can a practice that is thousands, at least over 3,000 years old, as goes the time this is being written and expressed. Thousands more beyond that, perhaps, to the very birth of human civilization, okay? So, diving into Hebrew etymology a little bit, the word translated for us in English, burnt, comes from the Hebrew word olah, and it means whole burnt offering. BDB, Brown Driver Briggs, a great Hebrew lexicon to use in conjunction with your NAS and or your Strongs, but they do a little bit more to try to elaborate definitively as goes what these words can mean and how they're expressed. So what that actually says as a resource is that the burnt offering is to be understood, entirely consumed, nothing from it is taken off the altar and eaten by any person, but the concept of the olah, and that's how I'm going to refer to this many more times throughout the course of the evening, is the olah offering, is that it is expressing the assent of the soul in worship. Because olah, while it may be translated burnt for us in Hebrew, is really connoting the idea of ascending. Because when you've got the animal on top of the altar, let's just say that's a dead carcass. The thing's been lit on fire. What is coming up from that? And where is it going? And you can say the action of it leaving the altar or the surface of the carcass and going up toward the sky would be what? Ascending. Ascending. Okay, that's great. It's not hard to really surmise all that. Is there anything else going on here? Let's dive further. He is to bring an unblemished male. That word from Hebrew is tamim, which simply means it's complete or sound. The opposite to that would be mum, which is to have blemish or defect. And to see both of these words operate together in the same context, we go to Leviticus 22. Any man who presents his offering as burnt offerings must offer a tamim male. You are not to present anything that has a mum, okay? The idea is that this thing cannot have a, somehow maimed limb or a missing eye or two heads or anything like that. Considering the idea that you're looking at the animal itself, it is to be to the eye in visual inspection, as much as one is trained to recognize these things, a healthily sound animal that is complete in all its faculties and constituency. Does that make sense? That is all we are to take away from that. If we were to ask the question, does this speak to a moral attribute of the animal, literally or figuratively? That's a simple, closed-ended question. It has to be either a yes, but if yes, then what proof can we offer from the Bible? Where do we find chapter and verse that speaks to the idea of this in some way speaks to the moral constitution of the animal itself? I'm not saying it's not there. I'm just saying these are the things that we have to ask as biblical students attempting to rightly divide God's Word so that we can better understand as we are putting ourselves into the mind of the little Israelite bouncing around in our heads trying to explain this text to us and get a better feel for what the original readers and those who would experience these things in real time and space, what they were to understand. What I mean by that is that it doesn't behoove us to simply just turn to the annals of Christian theology to try to put back together in some forensic manner some sort of cultic tradition or practice like this and just simply take their understanding of that, as limited as it was, as being the only possible way of seeing these things. That's part of the reason why I won't say modern scholarship always churns out great products, but as we continue to explore the texts and, of course, find new resources that henceforth had not been known to previous generations that help us better understand how these words work in other ancient contexts, especially considering Hebrew is not the only Semitic language out there. It helps expand our understanding of how these things worked, especially considering a lot of other ancient Near Eastern cultures and civilizations had cultic practices that in lots of ways paralleled or were almost exact replicas of what you see going on in the cultus of Israel itself. So how does this differ? What does God do to set it apart and make it holy? What does He intend for these sacrifices to connote? And we don't have literature from that time period outside of the Bible to help us understand that. So we have to work through what we have and allow the understanding of it to evolve in time. And one thing that we cannot do is allow ourselves to only go to Christian sources and fail to take into consideration Jewish scholarship as well. After all, who were these words originally given to, Jews or Christians? And who were the people observing these practices for hundreds of years before Christianity ever came into existence? And so it would certainly help us to lean on their shoulders in the scholastic sense to understand a little bit more of what may be at play here. So if it does not speak to the morality of the animal, then what exactly is the purpose of this? Going from what the Bible has said so far, if we turn the pages back to Genesis 1, we find this interesting little fact, that all the wildlife of the earth, whether bird of the sky or creature that crawls on the earth, everything has within it the breath of life. Who provided the breath of life? Breath of life? Okay. Then we flip the page over to Genesis 2, when God makes the man, not said of him here in Genesis 1, but it is uniquely in Genesis 2, that the Lord formed the man and breathed the breath of life into his nostrils. The man became a living being. So of all things that exist that God has made through the course of the creation week, what falls into the category of having within it the breath of life and thereby being considered a nefesh, a soul, an ensouled creature? It's right there on the screen. Throw out some words for me. What is considered a living being? Beautiful answer. To go a little bit more specifically, birds, creatures that crawl. So things that were made on day 6, birds were not. But everything else that has the breath of life in it, animals and man created on the same day, both have within them the breath of life. From the biblical standpoint, and I'm invoking no evolutionary concept or thought by this, but from the biblical standpoint, man is considered to be amongst the animals. Hence the speech of that very thing with the idea of ruling over the animals, and even Jesus out there in Mark 1 being amongst the wild beasts. It's not to say he came from animals, but there's a reason why we share one day of creation with each other and not created separately on our own specific day. And why it is said very clearly that we are the ones above all animals that bear God's image, and there are no suitors for man amongst the beasts of the field, except for what was taken from him and made to come alongside him to be his helpmate and the one he gets to become one flesh with. Are we tracking so far? So with that, what can we perhaps surmise? That maybe in this concept of offering a burnt offering, the worshiper will become one with the animal who will serve as the substitute for the worshiper. It might not make sense now. Let's build on this before we start asking questions. Now we jump into this part of the text, that he is to lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering. This from the Hebrew is known as the samak or samikah, as the actual practice is considered. And it means to lean, to lay, to uphold. In other contexts, it even means to sustain or to suspend in certain cases. But nonetheless, we have to ask the question, what is the purpose of this rite? It's seen operatively in sacrifices. This is one of those circumstances. Another one would be for consecration, because at the time of the installment of the Levites, the entire congregation come forth and they put their hands on the Levites. When Joshua is installed to be Moses' successor, hands by Moses are laid upon Joshua for that consecrative moment where now he is recognized in front of the community to take Moses' place, or to even serve as a witness. When people are noted to be stoned to death, in the handful of instances we see this in the books of Moses or Joshua, people come forward and lay their hands, serving as witnesses, identifying with the fact that I am pledging myself to what was spoken of in truth here today, that is condemning this person to death, and by virtue of that, I am saying I stand by my word and I identify with what's going on here, all right? So we see a multitude of contexts this practice is used in, not just solely for sacrifice, as the examples there that you have. But another one is the idea of sin, all right? And the idea of expressing or transferring sin. We're going to explore some of that. Is this meant to be seen here? In other words, in the context of what we just read, do we see in front of you where you have your Bibles open, and what I just read to you from those 9 verses or the remains of this chapter, do you see anything in there that tells you in black and white that the person doing this and laying a hand on the head of the animal is thereby either confessing sin, or are we to understand that they are transferring sin to the animal? Go ahead. I'll give you 20 seconds to see if you can find some. No?
No, but I mean, it says atonement, so that's why our mind goes to the sin.
You're right. You're right. So we need to explore that, all right? And I'm not saying that it doesn't. Please do not take that to be what I'm doing. I'm not saying that it doesn't. I'm just trying to get you to think through the text before you allow any sort of baggage from what you have been taught before, or what you are thinking. Hence, we're risking conflating of ideas here throughout the rest of the biblical corpus from other texts and allowing all this imagery to start to blur in our minds and seep through to superimpose something on this text that's not meant to be there. So if that's not the case, then what is it? I've got an arrow pointing to blasphemers, but I mean for us to see the whole spectrum there of sacrifice and consecration as well. All right, so the use of atonement in various other texts. This word, atonement, comes from the Hebrew word, kafar. Just as a quick little 30-second blurb, we should understand that some of these words are translated from various Hebrew words because many words, as they do in English and many other languages, can serve as not only nouns, but verbs or adjectives, and when that happens, the spelling will change. It's not simply, or as simple as it is in English, by adding something like an ing to the end of it to show that noun has become verb, but usually other letters, whether it be vowels or whatnot, usually vowels, will change to connote that. So there are a multitude of words here, not just kafar, used to be translated as atonement. That can mean in certain contexts, and as we're understanding the idea of using lexicons, we don't take any possible definition that can be used for a word and put that into every context that word is used. That would be inappropriate. The context itself has to dictate what the definition moving forward is, and to say that that's always solid would be completely misjudging the text. Even today, thousands of years after these words were written, it is still hotly debated in scholarly circles, both Jewish and Christian, and working collaboratively with each other to understand what is the right sense of the word in some of these texts or various other Old Testament texts. So it could mean to cover over. The idea here would be what's going on, because the first use of this is actually in Genesis 6, where Noah is building the ark and he is told to cover it on the inside and outside with bitumen, pitch, tar, whatever you want to visualize in your mind. The idea is him atoning, although atonement obviously is not there, but kafar is. To pacify, obviously, wrathful, vengeful deity, ready to strike with thunderbolts from heaven. Let's get the big guy to calm down. Huge oversimplification, but that's the idea. Or to make propitiation. To make propitiation would be to, in a sense, chase away the wrath, to get the wrath to go away, to expiate for sin, to make amends. There's a lot of things operatively going on there with the idea of propitiate. We can't cover them all. But a couple of contexts here of the use of the word atonement. We see in the consecration of Aaron's sons in Exodus 29, it's not happening. This is the ceremony being described. It will happen in Leviticus 8. It's given almost verbatim in both senses. But they must eat those things by which atonement was made at the time of their ordination and consecration. But that's interesting, because if something is being used for atonement purposes, usually our mind goes to what specific text from the book of Leviticus in the middle of the book. I've really honed it down for you. A chapter that describes what? We've even mentioned the name of it here a couple times. The Day of Atonement, where we've got atonement being made and hands pressed down on the heads of animals and sin being confessed and transferred in a sense, right? If we're coming to this with that idea in mind, well, if I'm transferring my sin to an animal and that animal is not sacrificed, that animal in that context is sent away to the wilderness, the uninhabitable place, to carry sin away and never be seen again. Here's a question. Is that animal considered holy or cursed? Cursed. So if it's cursed and it's not meant to be sacrificed or eaten, would you agree then perhaps, or at least be willing to contemplate the idea, that something that has now taken on a curse and has become defiled by that action is not fit for holy space or human consumption? Because some of these sacrifices are going to be eaten by the priests or even the offerer in certain contexts. But if it has been defiled by sin, do you think it would be appropriate to consume it? Okay then, but Aaron and his sons are to eat the things, the animals that were used to make atonement for them at the time of their ordination. Interesting question. Or consecration of altars. 7 days you must make atonement for the altar. If atonement is only ever seen to wipe away or wash away, cleanse out the gutter of sin that is inhabiting said space, heart, sacred space, whatever the case might be. Why is it that an inanimate object like an altar has to be atoned for? Another example would be in chapter 30. You are to make an altar for the burning of incense. Once a year, Aaron is to perform the atonement ceremony for the altar. That, of course, on the Day of Atonement. The altars have not sinned. So what is atonement being provided for if we're considering strictly the idea of propitiation, the concept of it has sinned, it needs to be expunged? Or ransom money. We've already visited this concept here in Exodus 30 and other places. When you take a census of the Israelites to register them, each of the men must pay a ransom for his life to the Lord. That becomes the atonement price for the Israelites, and it's to be used for the tent of meeting and its services. So, I'm not going to re-elaborate what that's about, but the idea here is atonement is still in play, but no blood is being shed here. So how can atonement be had if blood is not shed? After all, it's the writer of Hebrews that says that forgiveness cannot be achieved without atonement, shedding of blood, at least that concept that we would attach to it. So, does it relate to sin then, the idea of this ransom money? Well, in Numbers 18, it says, you must certainly redeem a human firstborn. You will pay the redemption price for a month-old male. It's the same concept in mind here as goes the census of all the males that were delivered from Egypt. The atonement money that's taken as a ransom to God to buy back the infant male. Is that because the infant male has sinned and needs to have sin expiated? No. The idea, padah, from a couple of slides ago, ransom. The males redeemed from Egypt and the firstborn of every generation belong to the Lord. They have to be ransomed. Or in the concept of blatant rebellion, here we go. This gets right to the heart of the matter. Exodus 32, golden calf. Moses says, now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I'll be able to atone for your sin. When Moses goes up the summit to the mountain, assuming that's where he's going to meet the Lord in his presence there, does Moses offer a sacrifice for the people? What does he offer? Can't tell if somebody's trying to whisper it and be sly. Himself. He says, blot me out of your book. Does he not? And we'll actually revisit that here in just a minute. Or in Numbers 25 here, it will be a covenant, a perpetual priesthood for him and his future descendants because he was zealous for his God and made atonement for the Israelites. This was the moment when one of the Israelite men went and got a Midianite woman, was going to take him to his mama's tent and going to consummate a marriage with this woman. And Phinehas goes and gets a spear and he runs it right through both of them. He makes atonement for the people in the deliberate killing of these two people. Shedding of blood, not in the sacrificial sense. How does that make atonement, though? For the sin of all the people who were involved in that moment of rebellion. So does that relate to sin? Absolutely. But what kind of sin is in question? These are things we have to take into consideration here. This is not exhaustive, but on the left side of the screen, as you can see there in the middle, capital offenses all punishable by death. Consider a broader expansion of the Exodus 32 text. Moses returned to the Lord. Oh, these people have committed a grave sin. They've made a god of gold for themselves. Now, if you would forgive their sin, but if not, please erase me from the book you have written. The Lord replied to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will erase from my book. Now go, lead the people to the place I told you about. See, my angel will go before you. But on the day I settle accounts, I will hold them accountable for their sin. The Lord inflicted a plague on the people for what they did with the calf Aaron had made. 3,000 had fallen by the sword of the Levites. Now, an untold number of people died by plague. Did God accept Moses' offer of himself as atonement for the people? No. But it does set up a beautiful picture of how actual atonement is going to happen corporately for the covenant people of God. It speaks to what Messiah will do, hence the reason we talked about this glimpsing Messiah when we went through those texts. But nonetheless, God does not accept it in this sense. Or in Numbers 15, if one person sins unintentionally, he is to present a year-old female goat as a sin offering. The priest will then make atonement before the Lord on behalf of the person who acts in error, sinning unintentionally. And when he makes atonement for him, he will be forgiven. You are to have the same law for the person who acts in error, whether he is an Israelite or an alien who resides amongst you. But the person who acts defiantly, whether native or resident alien, blasphemes the Lord. It doesn't say and blasphemes the Lord. It says blasphemes the Lord. You act defiantly by sin of a high hand, meaning, I'll just do what I want. Blasphemy against God. That person is to be cut off. Karat, the same concept of circumcising foreskin. He will certainly be cut off because he has despised the Lord's word, broken his command, his guilt remains on him. So these capital offenses punishable by death, is atonement possible? If yes, Where is the proof in the Bible? Where do we have a context in which a person who sins by defiant, blatant acts of rebellion against the Lord, do we have them given space to offer an offering that will cover them for their sin and atone it, wash it away? I'm not saying there isn't one, but that's the challenge we have. If this is not possible, let's explore the idea of Exodus 21:14. If a person schemes and willfully acts against his neighbor to murder him, you must take him from my altar to be put to death. That kind of speaks to the idea that if the person was to seek restitution at the altar to make atonement, that God perhaps might not be willing to accept that, and even demanding that this person who may be profaning said altar be removed and capital justice be placed upon him by putting him to death. Just some things to consider, because these are issues we have to deal with respect to the text as we move forward. So far, any questions?
I have one. Sacrifice. Is this going on daily? Or we're talking, I understand the Day of Atonement one time a year, but we're also having sacrifices daily.
Yep.
So in the case that you just said, that he's presented at the altar of sacrifice, I mean, that could happen today, it could happen tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
So is the atonement that we're talking about, is it limited to the transgression?
That is an interesting question in and of itself.
And is it temporary?
Okay.
When I say temporary, because sin is forever.
Right.
And these atonements seem to be not the same.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I say temporary, it means that point is temporary because judgment is still to come on that sin.
Right. And what about... Absolutely. And what about the people who do these things and are never caught? The husband who commits adultery and nobody finds out. The person who does murder somebody but is able effectively to cover it up. Or perhaps has a high station. Let's think David. And nobody comes dragging him out of his house and wants to put that man to death. So does the Day of Atonement then, and again, we'll get to that a couple of weeks from now, but does the Day of Atonement expunge all that in a sense that we think of perhaps like Catholics who go and actually make confession to the priest and thereby receive absolution for said sins? Of course, there's a little bit more complexity to that theology there, moral or mortal or venial sins and whatnot, but the idea nonetheless is that you're good now, just don't go sin again. It's understood that you will sin again, though. Of course, what Christ has done has absolved your sin up until the day that you become one of His. But after that, you're kind of on your own type of deal to make sure you're living righteously, morally. The same can also be said here, because why is there a reminder made of sin year after year, as the writer of Hebrews says, if this was meant to be permanent? If it is possible for the blood of bulls and goats to achieve full, complete, total expiation for your sin, using the language from the writer of Hebrews, purge your conscience of your dead works. If that was possible, then why in the world will we need a greater, more superior sacrifice? So in that sense, it would certainly lend itself to the idea that this is not permanent, that the atonement in and of itself limited, not from the standpoint of the doctrines of grace, obviously, but not fully efficacious in what it is designed to do, and even to a larger extent to embrace your question of what about the sin? That's something that we're going to have to address here too as we dive deeper into this concept of things such as the sin offering. So hopefully I'll answer a little bit more of your question as we go. To make atonement for him, in what way is atonement to be understood in association with the burnt offering? Is atonement being made for sin? And by that I just mean generic sin. If yes, what will be the proof? To Judy's point, we go to the Day of Atonement text. The laying hands on the head of the animal. That's part of this rite. Samika is being committed here. So with that, is that not a transferal of sin? Maybe. Maybe it's not. It is in the Day of Atonement text, but the Day of Atonement text is not given here in Leviticus 1. If Leviticus 1 was the Day of Atonement text, it would be so easy and all too natural then to assume that every other offering after this, if the burnt offering was given in Leviticus 2, even if it was not said that the laying on of hands is meant to connote the concept of confessing sin and thereby transferring it to said animal, would be understood or implied in the text. That's not what we have. We have 4 offerings that are mentioned here of laying on hand, on head, no confession of sin, no mention of transference until we get to the Day of Atonement. So are we meant to conflate them, or should we keep them separate? I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm going to try to guide you, and then hopefully at some point you come to peace with the text in and of yourself. But if it were meant to see in the light of the Day of Atonement what's going on there, the high priest confesses sin over the goat, that goat is sent away. The burnt offering here, this animal is sacrificed. And some of these others, it's going to be sacrificed and parts of the animal consumed by a priest or offerer or both. Why is it that the animal on the Day of Atonement is sent away? It's to carry the sin away. It's never meant to be seen again. Why wouldn't the same thing be operative here? If the idea is that the animal that has the sin confessed over it and transferred into it was to be slain in the place of the offerer/offender, then would we not also see that in this case when atonement is being made mention of? I would think so. I'm not telling you yes or no. I'm just saying I would think so. If not, then what's the purpose? To make the offerer, perhaps to make the offerer fit for sacred space. Consider the question of the psalmist who says in Psalm 24, "Who may ascend the mountain of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place? The one who has clean hands and a pure heart." On Sinai, we have fire and smoke and God descending, and this is all holy space, a pseudo-Eden. Then, and we've got barriers around it to define holy space and whatnot, God tells them to make a mishkan, a dwelling place, where His glory cloud descends on, and we've got barriers to keep everybody else. It's a flat, three-dimensional structure, mostly set up on a plane, but what we're supposed to see with that, if we were to take and turn this and see it from this perspective, that this is the outer courtyard, that big shrine is meant to be on God's holy mountain. That's not a bowling pin, that's a mountain, so don't laugh. But anyway, that's what we're supposed to symbolize or understand is going on there, that shrine becomes God's cosmic mountain. This is ancient cosmic cosmogony at work here. The idea of what was going on in Eden working here in this very context. So who gets to ascend to the mountain of the Lord? The one with clean hands and pure heart. Who amongst God's people has clean hands and pure heart? How do you get that? This is part of the means of answering that question, but it does come with limitations. Is expiation, a very simple way of looking at that, amends making necessary? In other words, has the offerer become an offender? Have they done something willfully that needs to be taken care of before God will accept this? If yes, then where's the proof? If it's an unintentional sinful act, there's a different offering for this. It's not the burnt offering. Now, not to say these offerings cannot be given in conjunction with each other. Oftentimes, a burnt offering would be given to precede any of the rest of these offerings, or alongside them, in other words, all simultaneously together. But a burnt offering might be given before a sin or purification offering, okay? If it's not the purpose, if they've not done anything to offend God outright, then what could this mean? Maybe the offerer intends to come as close to as possible in physical proximity to God, but that's dangerous. After all, Mount Sinai, what was the purpose of these barriers? If these people are overly zealous and want to go run straight up to the very presence of God, if this whole fire, cloud, thunder thing here didn't scare the bejesus out of them, what was this meant for? Keep them away, and better yet, to protect them, because God says, my holiness will break out against them. It will kill them. Nadab and Abihu, great reminders of that. So the gift of the sacrifice, perhaps, is most likely to ransom him from God's wrath or holiness, because God's wrath, by virtue of them treating his space and his personage as common or profane, could thereby be met with this. This is, in some sense, the idea of the worshiper wanting to identify with the animal, and by virtue of him and the animal becoming one, in the sense that now the animal is going to do what he cannot. It's pretty much a one-and-done offering if the man climbs up on the altar and then consumes or is consumed in the flames of the altar, right? Because he's not going to get up from that. If the idea here is that he wants to ascend unto God's presence as an act of worship, of greeting unto God, he cannot do it and continue to live. One has to do it in his place. So the idea of laying on the hand to the head of the animal and identifying with said animal, kind of the same way of the way people operate as witnesses in a summary execution, or maybe even identifying as part of the covenant community and wanting to consecrate a person for office like Joshua. Same thing here, perhaps, is what's operative. And the animal is ascending unto God as the act of worship on the part of the person. Perhaps that is what's actually going on here. I want to read to you a little bit of commentary here from Baruch Levine on Leviticus, where he says about this concept of the laying on of hands. This symbolic act, known in later Hebrew as simikah, the laying on of hands, served to assign a sacrificial victim for use in a particular rite, in this case, an olah. This act had other uses as well, and these help to clarify the meaning. By the laying on of hands, those in authority can invest other persons with offices of authority. Moses laid his hands on Joshua when appointing him leader of the Israelite people, as we read in Numbers 27 and Deuteronomy 34. In the same way, in Numbers 8, the Israelites are instructed to lay their hands on the Levites. If convicted of blasphemy, in Leviticus 24, we read that the members of the community are to lay their hands on a person convicted of blasphemy, thereby identifying him as the guilty party. Thus, the laying on of hands may not have been a cultic rite originally, but rather a juridic or legal procedure, that it may be acceptable in his behalf to provide expiation for him. Rather, by its acceptance on his behalf, it serves as redemption for him. Usually, the formula la kafar al means to perform rites of expiation over, near, or with respect to a person or group of people or an object, such as the altar. But this sense is not suitable here, because as a type of sacrifice, the olah was not occasioned by an offense that would have placed the offender in need of expiation. They've not done anything wrong, so why do they need atonement made for sin? If it's not to atone for sin, then what is it for? Cover? Cover, perhaps, to make them allowed to enter as far as they can into sacred space now? I know it's a very rudimentary way of looking at it, but kind of think of it like a spacesuit, right? Or maybe a biohazard suit. You were to go up to Fort Detrick, Maryland, where they have level 4 biohazard material, such as Ebola virus and various other things. You're probably not going to walk into that lab in just your street clothes, are you? You go out there, you're going to go through the whole process of decon, you're going to put on that alien suit they're walking around in, an ET or whatever, that's got oxygen pumped into it to keep you as separate as you possibly can be from every bad little pathogen in there, is just waiting to course itself into your body. Because you cannot go into God's sacred space. Hence, Exodus 40, God fills that space. Even Moses and Aaron can't go in until these rites have been observed. For crying out loud, the priests can't even go in there until they've had a whole ceremony of blood being shed and anointed on different spots of their body, special garments that have oil and blood sprinkled on them, and they got to stay in this place for 7 days. They can't even come out of there for 7 days to be properly installed, to just minister in sacred space. A lot going on there that, again, I think we might have a tendency to somewhat oversimplify. All right, so that's the bulk of what I have to say. The rest of this is probably going to fly by a little bit more smoothly. Go into Leviticus 6, because more is said to expand upon this. Leviticus 6, verses 8 through 13. The Lord spoke to Moses, "Command Aaron and his sons, this is the law of the burnt offering. The burnt offering itself must remain on the altar's hearth all night until morning, while the fire of the altar is kept burning on it. The priest is to put on his linen robe, linen garments, or undergarments. He is to remove the ashes of the burnt offering the fire has consumed on the altar and place them beside the altar. Then he will take off his garments, put on other clothes, ordinary clothes, bring the ashes outside the camp to a ceremonially clean place. The fire on the altar is to be kept burning. It must not go out. Every morning the priest will burn wood on the fire. He was to arrange the burnt offering on the fire, burn the fat portions from the fellowship offerings on it. Fire must be kept burning on the altar continually. It must not go out." So, the offerer has to do this. Lay their head or hand on the animal's head. Maybe that means become one with the animal. Slaughter the animal. So the priest does not do this. They are the ones slicing and dicing. They got to skin it, dismember it, which is the fullest expression then of the life being offered, because to cut this thing into pieces and then to give it to the priest to be arranged, the idea, of course, is that there's nothing else that can be done to this animal by yourself. That's what the fire on the altar is for, is to finish the job. Then wash the carcass with water. What would be the point of that? I mean, no doubt it's a nasty, bloody process. You cut open the abdominal cavity, entrails come out, and then as those things bust open, maybe it's possible some dung gets in there, and so naturally that's unclean, that profanes. Who knows what else needs to be utterly cleaned out of there? But the word rakatz, bathe the body, is considered here. And if we take into consideration what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 6, but you were washed, made fit now for sacred space, cleansed. Consider the idea that this animal is being cleansed on the inside and out, so that if I am this animal and it is me, I am being washed and purified outwardly to make me fit then for what this offering is supposed to accomplish, which is allowing me to ascend in worship unto God's holy mountain. Who can ascend into the mountain of the Lord? The one who has clean hands and pure heart. Is it starting to make sense? And then the priest, they got to do all this stuff right here. They have to splatter the blood, prepare wood and fire, arrange the pieces of the sacrifice, not the wood. They do that too. Burn all of the animal, keep the fire burning all night long, remove the ashes, dispose of those. Why is all this on the shoulders of the priest? Where is this altar? It's right here. What is all of this? Sacred space. Who gets to operate in sacred space? All of us or just some of us? These cats. They're the ones that get to manipulate holy things. And once this is an offering given over unto the Lord, it becomes His, and thereby it is holy. All right, burnt offering. Any questions on that? Anything I have said that may have confused? Okay. So Leviticus 2, 1 through 10. When anyone presents a grain offering as an offering to the Lord, it is to consist of fine flour. He is to pour olive oil on it, put frankincense on it, bring it to Aaron's sons, the priest. The priest will take a handful of fine flour and oil from it, along with its frankincense, and will burn this memorial portion of it on the altar, a food offering, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. Let it not escape our minds that from this point on, we're going to be talking about food offerings. So the idea here is that if it's a food offering being offered to God, it would seem like this is something of an invitation. That's the way this is supposed to be understood. And just as a byword here, it's not to be seen as a basket or a pan or a griddle, a bowl brought up there with actual flour in it. It's the idea of kneaded dough, even though it's often translated as fine flour, and we're thinking of them picking up a batch of that and putting it on the altar. Most scholars assume it to be a dough that's already been kneaded, obviously without yeast, but we'll get into that here in just a second. But the rest of the grain offering will belong to Aaron and his sons. It is the holiest part of the food offerings to the Lord. When we read that speech, it is the holiest or most holy of the food offerings. That means there are only certain people who can eat it. If you had to guess, who do you think those people are? Priests, exactly right. Commoners cannot eat these. And of course, there are even further restrictions, have to be clean. All right. When you present a grain offering baked in an oven, it is to be made of fine flour, either unleavened cakes mixed with oil or unleavened wafers coated with oil. If your offering is a grain offering prepared on a griddle, it is to be unleavened bread made of fine flour mixed with oil. Break it into pieces. Pour oil on it. It is a grain offering. If your grain offering is a grain offering prepared in a pan, it is to be made of fine flour with oil. When you bring it to the Lord, the grain offering made in any of these ways, it is to be presented to the priest. He will take it to the altar. The priest will remove the memorial portion from the grain offering and burn it on the altar, a food offering, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. But the rest of the grain offering will belong to Aaron and his sons. It is the holiest part of the food offerings to the Lord. To clear up any sense of confusion, the table on the bread, or the bread, the bread on the table of the bread of the presence in this part of the tabernacle is not bread that is eaten every day. You bake it on the Sabbath. You put it there on the table. It sits there till the next Sabbath. When it's replaced by fresh loaves, then it can be eaten. This is the bread that's provided daily for their sustenance while they are working, offering, ministering. So pretty simple process. You pour oil on it, whatever it is you're offering. Either it's already baked or you're bringing it to be baked on the altar itself once it's placed there and fire does its thing, providing the heat. Huh?
This is done at home?
Some of it can. If it's already prepared in a pan or a griddle, if you bring it as a finished product, then you have to break it into pieces. You have to break it into pieces, and a piece given as a memorial portion, it is placed on the altar and burned, given to God. Consider this, in a sense, a divine elevator. I'm not trying to be sacrilegious, but in a sense, ascension, that's what it is. You're giving God His piece. The rest of it then belongs to Aaron and his sons. Now, if you don't finish the process, you bring it in some utensil. If it's not suitable for baking or to be exposed to the element of heat itself, then it has to be transferred into one of those vessels suitable for that. This is all coming from other literature outside of the Bible to help make sense of the gray areas. And then it's finished off there, but before it is, a portion of that is pinched off and given to the Lord, of course, mixed with oil and frankincense.
I've been, as you're going, I'm looking at the temple setup.
Yeah.
So we're only talking just the altar. The burnt offering, there's two altars.
Right. Burnt offering.
And
Altar of
there's
burnt
an
offering.
altar of incense. So
Mhm.
everything is taking place on this
Yeah.
altar.
Yeah.
And so the priests, are they cooking and doing all this
Yes.
prep?
Yes,
All this?
absolutely. Because again, if it's brought as an unfinished product, they'll have to. Any of these meat offerings, you are not allowed to sacrifice at home.
And I'm not allowed to be in there, so I'm giving it to
Exactly.
the priest, and they take care of it on my behalf.
That's the presumptive understanding, because we don't have anything from the time to tell us specifically how that happened. This is just something that we have to somewhat infer.
How many people and how many times a day? And it's like millions, you know what I'm saying? I know,
Yeah.
How does one altar, I mean,
Handle it.
Exactly.
you can't bake cakes at Atwood's. you
I'm
know?
thinking of the
That
cleaning,
fast.
I'm thinking just cleaning up.
Yeah, I mean, it's no doubt a very bloody mess. And thankfully, they got to move, every now and again, and to carve out new space that perhaps, I don't know how they were able to clean up all the blood. I mean, thankfully, dirt is a great absorbent and whatnot, but when you get into the land of Canaan, again, I don't know how they answer all those questions. And no doubt, it is a small altar, but at various times, it may not have been as busy as at others, considering the times of the year, but certainly, 7th month of the year, that is the busiest time, when for days on end, you're offering a bull, a ram, 7 lambs, and the regular morning and evening sacrifices. We'll explore some more of that stuff as we go. But of course, cannot have fermentative products such as yeast or honey, considering what happens through the process of fermentation, breaking things down. It's death, tainting something that is considered most holy, right? If death symbolizes curse, the idea of something that's being consumed by someone is to connote the idea that something that is cursed cannot be put inside the body. There is no speech here that speaks of the bread becoming cursed, but that's the idea, is that would taint the bread if you add leaven or honey, because honey can ferment. Have to add salt. Love to go into that, but I don't have the time. Break it if it's baked, present it to the priest, and then, of course, he does his thing that we've already talked about. But this is interesting to kind of help back build a little bit more of the idea of burnt offerings and can it atone for sin. If a priest personally, as a worshiper, wants to make a grain offering, the grain offering itself becomes a burnt offering. So if it's a burnt offering, but it does not contain blood, blood is not making atonement here, but yet is considered to be in the same quality and caliber of a burnt offering, because that's how the priest is to offer. Think about it like this. The priest gets to eat that food because he's God's physical representative on earth when I bring it. But there is no physical representative when the physical representative is making the offering himself for himself. It is fully given to God. So it helps lend more of the idea, I think, to the concept of burnt offering ascending unto God as an act of worship.
Is it because the priest didn't have the means to get an animal or?
I wouldn't think so, because they do actually have livestock. They have livestock, and they have their own cities, they have their own fields, not to the extent that others within the Israelite territory will, but they do have those things allotted to them. So they have fields they can work, they do have the ability to harvest and have flour to be able to sustain and feed themselves. But of course, this sustenance for those who are occupying sacred space at the time, and all the Levites and priests cannot be there as generations multiply and more start to work these spaces. All right, the fellowship offering, another food offering from Leviticus 3, 1 through 5. And then we'll jump to Leviticus 7. If his offering is a fellowship, in some contexts it's considered to be a greeting offering, a fellowship sacrifice, and he is presenting an animal from the herd, whether male or female, he is to present one without blemish, one that is considered a tamim, before the Lord. He is to lay his hand on the head of the offering and slaughter it at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Then Aaron's sons, the priests, will splatter the blood on all sides of the altar. He'll present part of the fellowship sacrifice as a food offering to the Lord. The fat surrounding the entrails, the fat on the entrails, and the 2 kidneys with the fat on them, and all the fat on the loins. He will also remove the fatty lobe of the liver with the kidneys. Aaron's son will burn them on the altar along with the burnt offering that is on the burning wood, a food offering, a pleasing aroma. And then from chapter 7, verses 11 through 21, now this is the law of the fellowship sacrifice that someone may present to the Lord. If he presents it for thanksgiving, in addition to the thanksgiving sacrifice, he is to present unleavened cakes mixed with oil, olive oil, unleavened wafers coated with oil, and well-kneaded cakes of fine flour mixed with oil. I'm going to stop right there just for the sake of time, so that way we can try to cover more tonight. But the concept is that it is in most contexts to be offered with a grain offering. So what do you think then, before we look at this, which is in most cases almost verbatim what we've seen on the slide before and what we'll see on slides that come after this. If you're thinking about the concept of this being a fellowship offering, a greeting offering unto the Lord, meat mixed with bread, what do you think this is setting up the atmosphere for? Where have you seen this kind of thing before, where an animal is slain, its blood manipulated, unleavened bread consumed along with meat from said sacrifice? And what's happening there? It's not just atonement. Let's not look at that or focus as part of that. After they do the whole splattering the blood all over the door spots they're supposed to, then they go inside their house to have a what? Exactly, a meal, fellowship meal. So the idea here is that one is getting the chance to even invite a priest into this, because priests get to eat from part of the grain offering. They get to eat a specific portion of this. And then, of course, God gets his memorial portion, the best of it, which is the fat and all of these organs that are offered up as their own little separate pile of carnage that God takes up unto himself. It's not considered to be a burnt offering. It's just his particular portion. And some of this meat can be left over to the next day, but not to the third day. And remember, that specific criteria was also passed on with respect to Passover. Nothing was to survive to the next day. Anything that was left over and not consumed had to be burnt. So we see there specifically, the priests are to eat a portion of the cakes. They are to eat the breast portion and the thigh portion that are reserved for them. A great big old shindig that they get to invite God and priest to be able to enjoy. Now to get us here to the sin or purification offering. Remember, as we've already discussed, kata can mean sin or purify, 30 times in Leviticus, 18 times there in Numbers. Let's read from Leviticus chapter 4. I'm just going to read these verses. It's a smattering of verses. You can try to follow me, but there are a lot of them blended together, because there are different things going on here with respect to who personally is offering, what animal they offer, and then what portions of the animal might be burnt or not burnt, and if blood is manipulated, where that blood is applied. Tell the Israelites when someone sins unintentionally. I've highlighted that for you down at the bottom of the screen. When someone sins unintentionally against any of the Lord's commands and does anything prohibited by them, if the anointed priest sins, bringing guilt on the people, he is to present to the Lord a young tamim bull. If the whole community of Israel, then the assembly must present a young bull, unblemished. He or they is or are to bring the bull to the entrance to the tent of meeting before the Lord, lay his or their hands on the bull's head, and slaughter it before the Lord. The anointed priest will then take some of the bull's blood and bring it to the tent of meeting. The priest is to dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle some of it 7 times before the Lord in front of the curtain of the sanctuary, right here. That's the sanctuary. This 15 by 15 room, that's the curtain we're talking about right there that I've rubbed out with my finger. So hopefully you understand that's what we're talking about, okay? The priest is to apply some of the blood on the horns of the altar of fragrant incense that is before the Lord in the tent of meeting. He must pour out the rest of the bull's blood at the base of the altar of burnt offering that is at the entrance to the tent of meeting. He is to remove all the fat from the bull of the sin offering. The priest is to burn them on the altar of burnt offering, but the hide of the bull and all its flesh with its head and legs and entrails and waist, all the rest of the bull he must bring to a ceremonially clean place outside the camp to an ash heap, must burn it on a wood fire. It is to be burned at the ash heap. To save more time, because more is said here with respect to what happens if a leader, which could be a tribal chieftain, clan leader, could be a judge of the people, elder at the city gates kind of deal, someone with vested authority. If they sin, then what happens? They bring a male goat. If it's a commoner, a female goat, obviously all unblemished. Same thing with laying on hand to head, and no confession made here of sin, as is mentioned in the text. One might think that is operatively what must be going on. After all, this is called a kata, a sin offering, correct? Well, consider this, though. what happens with that animal once it's diced up, pieces laid on the altar, and then burned. If it's a priest or the whole community that are the culprits here, and blood is taken inside the inner sanctum and sprinkled here on or before the curtain and then on the altar of incense, that animal cannot be consumed. That is all God's. This is all sacred space where he occupies. It's his. If it's a ruler or a commoner, on the other hand, blood stays here, does not go in here. That can be eaten. So if sin was being transferred to the animal now becomes cursed, defiled by said sin. But it was a ruler who brought this male goat to offer it for their unintentional sin. Do you think then that the priest would be eating something that would defile them by passing this cursed thing into their bodies that are consecrated to minister here in sacred space? What say you? Do you think that is what would be going on? I would think not. It just doesn't seem to make sense that if the Day of Atonement concept here is at play and the scapegoat sent to Azazel, the uninhabited place, to carry sins away as the cursed thing, is supposed to also be seen in this animal here that is offered and slaughtered for sin because sin has been transferred to said animal. Why would we be consuming the animal? Now, granted, the commoner or offerer doesn't. The priest does. Those are some things to take into consideration here. And of course, where is blood being applied? Let's look at that for a second. So what kind of offering, can this offering be used for sin of any kind? Notice how it is said repetitively through this chapter. At least 3 different spaces. When someone sins unintentionally against any of the Lord's commands, how do we break that down? Well, Numbers 15, if any person sins unintentionally, he is to present a year-old female goat as a sin offering. However, in verse 30, but the person who acts defiantly blasphemes the Lord. This person is to be cut off from his people. So to sin unintentionally would be to err in ignorance because you didn't know the law. You presumed a holy thing as common and you misused that. Maybe you ate sacred fat from the animal that belongs to the Lord, assuming it to be common fat that you can consume. The priest corrects you on that. Once you are made aware of that, you unintentionally sinned, you have to offer this prescriptive remedy. But if you just decide to chow down on a kidney out of that bull because you thought that's the best thing in that animal, and I want it, but that's dedicated to God, guess what the law of Leviticus says? You have to be cut off. You are not allowed to eat what is strictly the Lord's. If you did that knowingly, that is a sin of high-handedness. Guess what? You get cut off from the people. So what does this mean then? Is this sin offering meant to expiate any and all sin, or just those that are committed in ignorance unintentionally? Remember, even the writer of Hebrews is riffing off this. But the high priest offers for himself and for the sins of the people that have been committed in ignorance. Why is the blood applied to different areas of the tent of meeting? Well, the priest, he occupies sacred space. So if he's the one that has somehow brought guilt on the people, again, unintentionally, not as a person. If he does this personally in his own life, then he has to offer as a person, not as a priest. But nonetheless, blood is here because it needs to purify, again, kata, sacred space. Not sin sacred space, purify sacred space. Same thing with the altar of incense. Why? Because the altar of incense is a conduit unto God, is it not? Incense is supposed to arise all day, every day. When Aaron trims the lamps, he is to make sure that this altar has incense placed on it every single day so that it never ceases to rise before the Lord. If this concept of ascension is at play here, it's also at play here. And that, with that operating in the back of our minds, then what we should understand, both are conduits to God. It needs to be purified so that this whole mechanism continues to flow and function appropriately without God's wrath being invited upon us because we have tainted sacred space. Same thing for the whole assembly, because the idea here is that they are being represented in sacred space by the priest. If a ruler, then it's applied to this particular altar, which is also a conduit to God, and the same thing for a commoner. Does that make sense? Somewhat, sort of, kind of, clear as mud? Okay, moving on. A little bit more on this whole concept of the purification offering, all right? When someone sins in any of these ways, now this is interesting. I'm not going to read the verses, But we do have a few case laws here that are given to us as examples of what will happen if a person was to say, fail to respond to a subpoena as a witness in a legal crime. Or maybe they touched something that's unclean and they did not know it. Like let's say Judy goes over to Angie's house and Angie just happens to be going through her menstruation at that point. And for some reason, Angie didn't tell Judy that. Judy sits on her bed or gently brushes by that bed and her clothes touch the bedding of that bed. Guess what? She's unclean. If Judy didn't know it, but Angie told her later, guess what has to happen? Got to offer the offering. It's just that simple. I mean, these are things that happen quite commonly in daily life in Israel. Or people have a tendency to come into space where death has come to occupy. You walk into a house to say, hey, Charlie, borrowing your lawnmower, running outside again, and Charlie didn't have a chance to tell you that his 95-year-old dad just took his last breath in the back room back there and is dead now. He needs to tell you that because you stepped in space that is being occupied by a dead body, and the moment that person is discovered to be dead, everybody in the house is ceremonially unclean. But because you were ignorant of that fact, now you might have to offer this offering. What happens if a person is too poor to be able to do this? Then they have two options. They can either offer 2 turtle doves or pigeons, or if they don't even have the money for that, they can offer up flour or a grain offering. But it's not used as a grain offering in this instance. That is burned, and it's actually offered in a separate way because a piece is given to the Lord, and the rest of it is given to the priest to eat, but the person can't eat it. The idea is that a portion is burned before the Lord. But how does, again, the idea of priest, if he makes his own grain offering, it's counted as a burnt offering. How in the world does flour or wheat, grain, atone for a person's sin? It doesn't. It's not meant to be seen as such. I think that's safe to be somewhat dogmatic about. All right, a couple more slides. This is quite simple, even though the name sounds somewhat heavy-handed. The guilt or restitution offering. So the idea here is that if you do something that is unintentional to bring guilt against any of the Lord's holy things. Let me just read a few verses here to take it straight from Scripture. Leviticus 5, starting in verse 14. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, if someone offends by sinning unintentionally in regard to any of the Lord's holy things, he must bring his penalty for guilt to the Lord, a tamim ram from the flock based on your assessment of its value in silver shekels according to the sanctuary shekel as a guilt offering. He is to make restitution for his sin regarding any holy thing. There are other opportunities here in which a person might incur guilt. These are examples of actual willful sins here in the beginning of chapter 6. Let's say a person willfully deceives his neighbor by somehow defrauding him through a monetary deposit. Say, no, man, you gave me 20 shekels to hold, not 100. Here, I got your 20 right here, but you're secretly pocketing the 80 for whatever nefarious purpose you have in mind. Monetary investments. Maybe you witness a robbery, but you fail to report it. Or you purposefully defraud your neighbor in some way. An example of this from the text itself, not in this chapter, but in other places. Let's say a man sleeps with another man's slave girl, and that slave girl has been betrothed to another man, but the marriage has not been consummated. By virtue of this man sleeping with this woman, that's not considered adultery, punished by death, but restitution has to be made by virtue of the fact slave is property. So a guilt offering has to be given. By virtue of the idea of guilt offering here, it's not to atone for sin and set one right with God, or so it would seem, but the idea of offering the animal is to assess the value of the thing that was profane. Consider a spoon that's supposed to be a holy object that is meant only for sacred purposes in the tabernacle. Somehow in the breaking down process and the clans of the Levites putting all these things in the carts, that somebody accidentally stuck a spoon in their pocket of their robe and forgot about it being there until they get to the next campsite. Then they take it out. Oh my gosh, I didn't realize that I put this holy object in my pocket. Now it's still kind of holy, but I need to do something to make sure that it returns back to its status. It's got to go through this whole purification process, and I've got to offer a guilt offering. Why? Because I treated a holy spoon like my kitchen spoon that I can do whatever I want to with. Spank my kids, stir a soup, doesn't matter. I can use that for common, profane purposes, but not this. That incurs guilt, but it was unintentional. It has to be paid by restitution. Make sense? This is how that operates. Not if I go and sleep with another man's wife committing adultery, but nobody else finds out about it, and I have a guilty conscience, then I come and offer this before the Lord, and by virtue of me offering this animal, I have my sin expiated before God, and I'm right as rain again. That's not in the context of this. All right, so believe it or not, we have actually made it through all 7 chapters because much of those texts revisit several places that we've already talked about. But having thrown a lot at you tonight, are there any final comments and or questions, things that might need to be cleared up before we move forward with where we'll explore next week? Not really sure if I'm going to take that as I did a good job or you guys just are ready to go. I'll just say this in closing. It is important for us to start to grasp what these are speaking of. And of course, recognizing that other people may watch this as part of our recorded platforms. I'm not saying here that substitutionary atonement is not operative. As much as there is not one single figure that you can point to in any of the corpus of biblical literature that comprises the Old Testament and say that person fully represents everything that Messiah was going to be and do, that it is a kaleidoscope of images, especially with various people, with very prolific figures like a David or a Moses, or even other ones that are not quite so profound and in the limelight as much as they are. But the blending together of these pictures that we see are a full 3-dimensional representation of everything that Jesus could bank on and say, how could you be so foolish and slow of heart? Everything that you saw going on in the Old Testament is speaking of me. The same can be said here. There is no one-for-one picture that we're going to point back to in the Old Testament, even the Day of Atonement, and say, that is exactly what Jesus did for us. Verbatim. No. It is a kaleidoscope of personal offerings in the sense of a Moses giving himself over for his people and saying, please blot me out of the book if you won't forgive them. Or a Phineas in his zeal skewering 2 people. Or a Aaron running out in the middle of the people where plague is literally knocking people down like dominoes and offering up incense and a censer, and where he meets the line where literally death and life are meeting, the plague stops and he makes atonement for the people without shedding blood. All of these blend together to speak of what Jesus would do, and the writer of Hebrews is grabbing that thought out of the sky and saying, if you think you turn back to this inferior product, you're going to get what he did for you. You are grievously mistaken, because what he did for you is so superior that it can scarcely be put in words. Because the law itself, as we have clearly seen through this amalgamation of examples, does not constitute a system whereby anyone who has done any kind of willfully blatant act of rebellious treachery against God can waltz right up to his holy temple or tabernacle, his tent of meeting, and expect to throw some blood out there, and that sin's going to be dealt with. And we'll see that in subsequent texts. We've already looked at a little bit of it here. There are plenty of things that must be met with death, the extremest of consequences, and no seeming possibility for atonement is offered. We have to deal with that tension in the text and look to what that means before we just assume what we have in Jesus is operative in the Old Testament, and the only thing we were waiting on is a more superior sacrifice to take the place of something that was kind of already working for the people. I hope that makes sense, because if it does, it'll help us successfully navigate the waters of next week's texts. All right. Appreciate your time.